Welcome to the Network Plus Prepcast, your dedicated audio companion for mastering every objective on the CompTIA Network Plus certification exam. This series is produced by baremetalcyber.com. In episode 140, we examine how attackers find their way into networks and how defenders can recognize and remove those pathways. One of the most critical steps in securing a network is understanding where weaknesses exist. These weaknesses are known as vulnerabilities, and they represent the entry points through which threats become actual attacks. Understanding vulnerabilities, along with related terms like exploits, exposure, and risk, is foundational for building stronger defenses. For Network Plus candidates, these concepts appear frequently on the exam and are part of the vocabulary used in real-world security assessments. Security doesn't begin with a firewall or an intrusion prevention system. It begins with the recognition that all systems have flaws, some introduced accidentally through coding errors, others through poor configuration or user behavior. These flaws become vulnerabilities, and if they are left exposed, they are eventually discovered and exploited. This episode focuses on helping you identify what constitutes a vulnerability, what makes it exploitable, and how to assess and reduce the level of risk. These concepts are critical for understanding how network defenses are structured and how attackers choose their targets. A vulnerability is any flaw or weakness in software, hardware, configuration, or operational process that can be used to compromise confidentiality, integrity, or availability. It may be a bug in a web server that lets attackers inject code, a misconfigured firewall rule that exposes internal systems, or even a lack of employee training that results in phishing success. Vulnerabilities can be accidental or intentional, discovered or still hidden, and may exist in individual devices or in overall system design. On the exam, expect to define vulnerabilities and recognize them in different forms. Common vulnerabilities include default usernames and passwords that have not been changed after installation, unpatched firmware that leaves devices open to known exploits, and unnecessary open ports or services that were never disabled after deployment. These weaknesses are simple to identify and fix, but are often overlooked. Attackers frequently scan for them as low-hanging fruit. The exam may ask you to recognize these common mistakes or prioritize which ones to fix first during a risk assessment. An exploit is the code, technique, or procedure used to take advantage of a vulnerability. While the vulnerability is the door, the exploit is the tool used to open it. Exploits may be custom-built or downloaded from the internet. They may be deployed manually by an attacker or automatically through malware or exploit kits. On the Network Plus exam, you'll need to distinguish between a vulnerability and the exploit that acts on it, and understand that fixing the vulnerability prevents the exploit from succeeding. In network environments, exploits often target services that are always running and widely used, such as DNS, HTTP, or SNMP. For example, an attacker might exploit an old version of an SNMP agent to leak configuration data, or inject malicious code into a poorly secured web server. Network-based exploits are often chained with other techniques such as reconnaissance, scanning, or social engineering to create a full attack path. The exam may present scenarios involving service-based exploits and ask you to identify the vulnerability being targeted. Exposure refers to how visible and accessible a vulnerability is. A web server with a known flaw is more exposed if it's publicly accessible on the internet than if it's behind a firewall. A system with default credentials that's only reachable on an internal management network has lower exposure than one accessible remotely. Network design plays a huge role in determining exposure. The fewer services exposed to untrusted networks, the lower the attack surface. The exam may include questions about exposure and how to reduce it through isolation, segmentation, or access controls. To understand security risk, it's important to understand how threats, vulnerabilities, and risk relate. A threat is the potential danger, such as a hacker, malware, or a disgruntled insider. A vulnerability is the weakness that allows the threat to succeed. Risk is the likelihood that a threat will successfully exploit a vulnerability, resulting in damage. Think of it this way. Threat is the storm, vulnerability is the leaky roof, and risk is the chance that your server room floods. On the exam, this relationship is commonly tested through terminology matching and scenario interpretation. There are different types of risk that security professionals must assess. Acceptable risk is the level of risk an organization is willing to tolerate. Residual risk is what remains after controls have been applied. Inherent risk is the natural level of risk without any protections. And mitigated risk is the result after implementing controls. Recognizing which type of risk is present informs which strategy to take. The exam will often include risk assessment questions that ask you to classify risk types or choose the best response based on current controls. Risk assessment is the process of identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing risks based on potential impact and likelihood. This involves identifying all assets, like servers, applications, and user accounts, determining what vulnerabilities exist, and evaluating how likely each threat is to occur. From there, organizations decide which risks to address first, which to monitor, and which to accept. Tools like vulnerability scanners, penetration testing, and audit logs are used during assessment. On the exam, you'll need to understand the steps of risk assessment and how prioritization is determined. Finally, exposure reduction is one of the most proactive steps you can take. By hardening systems, disabling unnecessary services, and enforcing secure configurations, you reduce the attack surface. Regular audits, configuration reviews, and software updates ensure that previously fixed vulnerabilities don't reemerge. Exposure is also reduced through segmentation, protected by firewalls or access lists. The exam may ask how to minimize exposure, or how different architecture choices impact vulnerability visibility. For more cyber content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Zero-day vulnerabilities are among the most dangerous types of flaws in any system. A zero-day is a vulnerability that has not yet been discovered by the vendor or the public. Because there's no patch or fix available, attackers who find it first have a significant advantage. Zero-day attacks can compromise systems with no warning, and detection is often difficult. Organizations rely on behavior monitoring, intrusion detection, and timely patching of similar vulnerabilities to reduce their risk. On the Network Plus exam, you may be asked to identify what makes zero days so threatening and how defenses must adapt in their absence. Patch management is one of the most important methods for mitigating known vulnerabilities. Once a vulnerability is disclosed, vendors typically release a patch to correct the issue. However, deploying that patch requires a structured process, scheduling maintenance windows, testing the patch to ensure it doesn't break other functionality, and tracking which systems have been updated. Skipping or delaying patches leave systems exposed. On the exam, you'll likely be asked how patching mitigates risk and what consequences result from poor patch management practices. Configuration errors are a common and often overlooked source of vulnerabilities. These include weak access control lists that allow too much traffic, overprivileged administrative accounts that are never reviewed, and default system settings that remain unchanged after deployment. Attackers look for these mistakes because they are easy to find and exploit. Misconfiguration can lead to open services, exposed data, or disabled logging, each of which can turn a minor issue into a major breach. Expect exam questions that ask you to spot misconfiguration in a scenario, or recommend ways to correct insecure settings. Vulnerability scanning tools play a vital role in detecting and documenting known weaknesses. These tools scan devices, software, and configurations for patterns or signatures that match published vulnerabilities. Some scan externally, simulating what an attacker would see. Others scan from inside the network, checking internal exposure. Many tools generate reports with severity ratings, fix recommendations, and links to patch resources. Regular scanning helps organizations maintain an accurate view of their security posture. On the exam, expect to identify what scanners do, when they should be used, and how their findings support mitigation planning. Exploit kits are packages of code designed to automatically attack known vulnerabilities. These kits often include multiple exploits and are used in mass attacks that target broad groups of users. An exploit kit may be embedded in a malicious website waiting to launch attacks as soon as a visitor's browser loads the page. Legacy systems, outdated software, and unpatched devices are prime targets. The automation makes these attacks scalable and difficult to stop once they begin. The exam may test your understanding of how exploit kits work and why up-to-date defenses are needed to protect against them. Human vulnerabilities continue to be one of the weakest links in any network defense. Users who create weak passwords, ignore security warnings, or misuse elevated privileges expose the system to compromise. A user who falls for a phishing email or reuses passwords across multiple systems makes it easier for attackers to gain access. Organizations must address human risk through regular training, policy enforcement, and least privilege access models. On the exam, you may be presented with scenarios involving user error and asked how to mitigate or prevent those risks. Monitoring for exploitation attempts is how security teams detect threats before damage is done. Intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems, or IDS and IPS, analyze traffic for known signatures or abnormal behavior. A spike in outbound connections, unauthorized changes to system files, or logging attempts from unexpected locations can all be signs of an attack. Security Information and Event Management Systems, or SIEMs, correlate data across devices and systems to paint a complete picture. Logging helps identify patterns and replay events after an incident. Expect the exam to include questions about how monitoring helps detect exploitation in real time. To summarize, vulnerabilities are fixable flaws, gaps in configuration, design, or code that allow unauthorized behavior. Exploits are the tools or techniques used to take advantage of those flaws. Exposure determines how visible those vulnerabilities are to potential attackers. Understanding this relationship is key to building a secure environment. By reducing exposure, applying patches, hardening systems, and educating users, organizations can break the chain that leads from vulnerability to breach. For Network Plus certification, this understanding is not optional. It's central to your ability to secure the network. To conclude episode 140, remember that the first step in any defense strategy is knowing where your weaknesses are. Vulnerabilities are not just technical, they include people, processes, and architecture. When a vulnerability is exposed, it's only a matter of time before it is exploited. Your job as a network professional is to reduce that exposure, eliminate as many vulnerabilities as possible, and monitor for signs of exploitation. On the exam and in real-world roles, this knowledge helps you assess risk, implement protections, and respond effectively to evolving threats. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Network Plus Prepcast, your trusted audio guide to the CompTIA Network Plus certification. This episode was produced by baremetalcyber.com. For more cybersecurity podcasts, books, and resources, visit baremetalcyber.com. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cybersecurity Plus podcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com. And before you take the test, make sure to check out the practice questions in the book Achieve CompTIA Security Plus SY0-701 Exam Success by Dr. Jason Edwards. They cover every domain and are a powerful way to lock in your knowledge.